Hey, ladies and gentlemen, let's celebrate 25th anniversary of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. 25th, or it may be even it's more years to celebrate, as we will probably find out soon. This presentation, this celebration is within the strand D, which is about wider communication skills to empower learners. And I think that this fact that we celebrate the Common European Framework fits exactly within the strand, because it's about widening communication skills and empowering learners. I think one of the messages of the framework. This is the abstract that you already have memorized, I guess, from the program. And what it says is that the publishing moment, 2001, is considered the reason why we are celebrating the 25th. However, we will find out more, and maybe we will see that the framework is older than it looks. The original CEFR authoring group is nicely displayed here, and we have a pleasure to have at least one of them with us here. And now it's time for me to present the prominent set of the panelists. May I start with Dr. Sarah Breslin, Executive Director of the European Center for Modern Languages and Head of Language Policy at the Council of Europe. I know you have heard this already, but it's a celebration, so I have to make it in this celebration mode. I like what it says in the program. She is a passionate linguist with a thorough understanding of both policy and practice in language and general education. Has worked in a range of sectors and countries in the field of language education as a teacher educator, senior manager, and in qualification development. Next to me here, we have Anna Solé, currently serving as a senior expert in multilingualism at the Schools and Multilingualism Unit within the Directorate General for Education, Youth, Sport, and Culture of the European Commission. But in addition to all these functions, administrative ones, she has conducted research on multilingual language acquisition in children, and following her assignment with the European Commission in 2001, she is now working on multilingualism policy and implementing the European Union recommendation on a comprehensive approach to language teaching and learning. Anyone has read this recommendation? I suppose all of you have. And if you have, then you'll notice how much reference to the framework you find in the text of this European Union recommendation. What surprised me in her biography was that she is not only an author of Multilingual from the Cradle, growing up with different languages, but also played the main character in the documentary, The Power of Babel, exploring the value of multilingualism. So we have an actor, a celebrity with us. Let's celebrate. We have also one of the authoring group, Brian North. Brian, I'm sorry, I had to cut your biography because it would not fit into one slide. He has been an English teacher, to begin with, project coordinator, course director, development manager, and researcher, among other functions. What is important here, I think, is that it was him coordinating the 1991 Intergovernmental Symposium that recommended the CEFR and European Language Portfolio, 1991, which means we are celebrating 35 years of the framework, at least. For this, he developed the levels and descriptors in his PhD as part of a Swiss National Science Foundation project. So this symposium, this legendary Röschlikon symposium, is probably the beginning of the framework to celebrate.
Or is it?
Or is it? Brian co-authored the CFR, the original one, the prototype European language portfolio, the manual for relating examinations to the CFR, and equals CFR core inventories for English and French. And more recently, as we all know, he coordinated the project that produced the companion volume and is main editor of Enriching 21st Century Language Education, the CFR companion volume, Examples from Practice, a collection of articles how to use the companion volume. Brian was also chair of Equals from 2005 to 2010 and is currently president of API, Action-Oriented Plurilingual and Intercultural Education Forum. I make a stop here because I could go on, but let's move further. And finally, last but not least, our Secretary General, Dr. Nick Saville, Director of Thought Leadership at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and Secretary General of ALTE. With 45 years experience in language education, 45 only, Nick? He has been advisor for the Council of Europe.
46, actually.
46, okay, a correction. Including for the CFR and its companion volume, and was co-editor of the Studies in Language Testing series, the legendary SILT series, if you want. His professional interests include plurilingualism, learning-oriented assessment, his hobby, I think, educational uses of AI, most recently, assessment literacy, and ethical frameworks in language assessment. What more would you wish to celebrate the framework in its 35th anniversary? I think we can now turn to the conversation that I would invite our panelists to engage in. I have sent a set of questions to all of them, however, not indicating who is in charge of which one. They would probably recognize some of them addressed to them, particularly, but some of them are pretty general, so that we see how this conversation develops. Good. I have already agreed with the administrative staff here that we will be a bit flexible with the time, because I don't know how this develops. I hope it does. So let's start with the first one, and please watch and admire the team, the original CFR authoring group. Daniel Kost, Brian North Life, Joe Shields, and John Trim, whose picture I was desperately looking for on internet and found finally one nice one. So if we go back to the original CFR, the first question that still keeps me busy in all the workshops that I'm offering on the framework is, which were the original overarching aims of the authoring group, and to which extent have they been achieved in the opinion of one of the authors? What would one of the authors say?
The first thing you'd say is this thing switched on? Yes, okay. Well, it might surprise you to know that the levels were not the original intention of the authoring group. The original intention, this is prior to and at the Röschlikon Symposium, was to create a kind of a mixture of, or a more expansive version of the threshold level, to define what are all of the categories and that are relevant in language learning, and in a kind of a taxonomic scheme to give a meta-language to help people to be able to communicate across borders and silos. And the levels came second. The levels came during the course of the Röschlikon Symposium. The levels were originally, the scale of levels with example descriptors were in the portfolio. And it was the delegates at the symposium who said, oh, no, if you're going to have a European framework, obviously the levels have got to be in the framework and not in the portfolio. So those are the two main points, and they're two aspects of the first main aim, which was to provide a common reference points, a common language to talk about language learning and teaching, and to assist networking across countries, across the different languages, etc. And then during this period, the second aspect was to try and move language learning in the direction of an action-oriented approach, which John Trim would have said that process started with the publication of Threshold Level in 1975 to put the emphasis on what people can do with the language. Yes. And there's a whole chapter on tasks in the original CFR, which emphasizes the fact that this was meant seriously at the time, that language learning should be oriented towards what people are able to actually do. And the other aspect was a plurilingual approach to language education, particularly in the CFR. The way it was expressed is a plurilingual approach to curriculum design, the way of organizing the teaching of languages, that there should be connections between the way that different languages are taught in the same institution. And there was also the definition and the introduction of plurilingualism. In fact, there's quite a lot about plurilingualism in the original CFR. So when people think that plurilingualism was something that came along later, that's kind of surprising, because the CFR more or less starts off with a section which says, what is plurilingualism? So, and of those things, I think the scheme, the idea of having the common reference points with the way of talking about language education and the levels, that has been pretty successful. The action-oriented approach, well, it depends how you interpret it. In the English language-speaking world, it was basically interpreted as being synonymous with the communicative approach, so not a lot happened. But in other countries, for other languages like French, there was quite a big movement. And finally, on the question of a plurilingual approach to language education, you really see that starting to happen in the after what's generally known as the multilingual turn from 2014. So it's really since then that you start to see serious moves towards trying to have a plurilingual approach to curricula in institutions.
Thank you, Brian. May I ask here, the first threshold level description, when was that published?
1975, and then there was a version for schools in 1976.
Which means it's not just 35 years, if we want, but it's 50 years at least, to go back to the point in time when it all started.
And there were some levels developed at that time as well.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, well, now let's move to the other contributions. ALTE was actively involved, right? What was the contribution of ALTE at this stage? And on from that.
Well, ALTE was formed in 1989-90 of a group of about 10 institutions who were the founder members following a meeting in Barcelona. And one of the goals of ALTE was to set up a framework for allowing meaningful comparison between certification in different languages. And at that time, for example, Cambridge was evolving its own framework around existing examinations. So the Certificate of Proficiency had been around since 1913 in its original form, had become popular in the 1970s and 80s, and then we had the first certificate. And these were two levels in the beginning of a framework, which had been expanded in the 1990s with the addition of a threshold level test, which was called the preliminary English test, and a wastage level test, which I helped to develop in the late 80s. So we already had in Cambridge a framework of levels emerging, but so did the Goethe, so did some of the others. These were based on levels which were meaningful to people in their education, that language education context. So we found ways to make meaningful comparisons. We found that almost everybody was using the threshold level by that point, for example. So we produced, as one of the early outcomes of the work of ALTE, the ALTE framework, which was a 5-level system. And ALTE members were also present at the Ruchikon Symposium in 1991. So we had people from Cambridge, my previous bosses, people from the Goethe Institute I know were there, and others who I can't remember. But we all came back and said, I think we're on the right track because there's going to be this European project. And we offered, as ALTE emerging, to help in whatever way we could. And after the publication of the first pilot draft, which was 1996, wasn't it, Brian? We offered to do some research by collecting views from stakeholders and analyze their views and the thoughts about it, and fed it back into the developmental process. So that was the 1990s where ALTE got involved.
Yeah, good to know. Brian?
I'd just like to add that in fact, in the run-up to the Ruchikon conference, there was a lot of communication between the organisers and, ALTE, Cambridge and ALTE, to make sure we didn't end up with 2 different systems of levels. There was a very conscious effort to make sure that we ended up with exactly the same system of levels, because this in itself, as Nick just mentioned, goes back to the 1970s. There had been an attempt to produce a European framework in the 1970s, of which threshold level, the idea of threshold level, was part. And there was
a unit credit system.
A unit credit system, that's right. And there was actually a scale of levels produced at that point in the report for the Intergovernmental Symposium, which took place in Ludwigshafen in 1977. It was published in 1978. And there was a set of 7 levels.
That was David Wilkins, wasn't it?
That was David Wilkins, who was one of the British delegates to the beginning of that project, which had been in 1971. Wilkins and John Trim had been the British delegates to this very first Council of Europe Intergovernmental Symposium in 1971. But anyway, those 7 levels, lopping off the top level, which was called ambilingual proficiency, the idea was that those levels would become the European levels. And in fact, that's what ALTE had been, Cambridge, what the sort of thing that Nick just described was working for the 5 middle of those 7 levels, basically. And we added the bottom level, which ALTE also did with Breakthrough, producing a specification for it, if I remember correctly. So there was a lot of cooperation, which also involved cooperation between the Council of Europe and the European Union, because ALTE was at that stage a European Union project, to make sure that this whole thing was coherent.
Thank you. Well, but we all know what the work of the Council of Europe is about. So in the essence, the project was coordinated, put forward and maintained by a political intergovernmental organization. In the essence, the aim was political as well as it turned out to be of practical value. So may I ask now, what is the value of the framework for the Council of Europe work on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, the 3 pillars of the activities of the Council?
Yes, thank you for the question, Waldek. I think probably more importantly, democracy and human rights. The European Convention on Human Rights is the cornerstone of the Council of Europe. And that's very much reflected in the CEFR's view of language users and learners as social agents. members of society with tasks to perform that are not purely linguistic. And that's where you can see that then in the can-do statements and the emphasis on autonomy and the emphasis on learning how to learn. But I think if we look also at human rights and we think back to the discussion this morning on social justice, we can see where there is a risk with the CEFR being misused and actually acting as an instrument that is infringing people's rights if it's being used as a gatekeeping instrument. And I think that's why it's very important that we're launching another joint survey with ALTE to find out what's happening across Europe. And we're also organising a roundtable on misuses and misunderstandings in relation to the CEFR, because they were never the aims of the CEFR. In fact, exactly the opposite, which takes me to the question of democracy. And linking up to what's been said before, both to John Trim and to the work that was done in the 70s, I came across something that he wrote about the project that led to the development of the threshold levels and then on to the CEFR. And this is what he said: as a Council of Europe project, the aim was to promote language learning not as an end in itself, though for many learners, especially perhaps the more gifted ones, that might be sufficient motivation, but rather as a contribution to the overarching political aims of the Council. It should serve to improve international understanding and cooperation, promote methods that strengthen democratic practices and develop the learner's independence of thought and action combined with social responsibility. So you see there really from the beginning the emphasis on languages and the link to democracy. And of course, more recently, as I mentioned in my presentation yesterday, in the other key instrument from the Council, the RFCDC, the Reference Framework of Competences for Democratic Culture, you see how linguistic competences, intercultural competences, that valuing linguistic diversity lie very much at the heart of that framework. And if you think of those two flagship instruments, the CEFR and the RFCDC, in many ways that's what was the push to come up with a new recommendation in 2022 to really stress the emphasis on, to put the emphasis on plurilingual and intercultural education, contributing to democracy and democratic culture. So it's been there from the very, very beginning, and it is very much a practical tool, but with a political importance.
Thank you, Sarah. The framework was published in its final form, 2001, European Year of Languages, jointly celebrated by the European Union and the Council of Europe, which means that these institutions discovered this document as useful and of value for both of them. So what is the value of the framework for the multilingualism policy of the Union?
It's huge.
Huge.
Enormous
That
value.
was short.
No. I mean, the EU is a super multilingual animal, no? 24 official languages, around 60 regional and minority languages on top of that, with different levels of officiality. And from the very beginning, there was this awareness that multilingualism was going to be the language of the European Union. In fact, the very first piece of legislation of the Union was establishing the principle of multilingualism. So, because we're talking history as well. So it's a cornerstone tool. It has a very practical value because the EU needs a currency. You may know the euro, but okay, for languages, it is the CEFR, the currency, right? We need a shared system that we all understand, because a very beautiful thing of it to the authors, it's simple, and yet there is a huge underlying complexity in it, right? So it merits these two important things. It underpins our policy. When you were presenting me, you were saying I work on the Council recommendation of 2019 on the comprehensive approach to the teaching and learning of languages. Well, this is the latest iteration, maybe, in a series of policy documents that come from a Barcelona objective. You hopefully know. In Barcelona, we said all young people should know language, their mother tongue +2. Now we say language of schooling +2. If you want to measure progress, you need to measure in a comparable manner, and that's what the CEFR brings to the table. We can assess, we can have then evidence-based policy because we have metrics, right? There were also several things in that recommendation which all member states are behind, so behind the principles, which are part of the CEFR, Learn and Center approach, emphasis in real-life communication, importance of language awareness in teaching, plurilingualism as a basis for teaching. We also have another council recommendation that is very relevant on the key competencies for lifelong learning. One of those 8 is multilingualism. So the Union believes that it is an essential skill for life in the 21st century, for your personal development, but also for active citizenship, especially as a citizen of Europe, because the beauty of Europe is mobility. You can work or study anywhere in the EU. But guess what? You're going to need languages for that. So that's super important. And then underpinning this mobility, we also have the CEFR. Let me give you 2 examples of 2 huge blocks of policies for which we need it: education and employment. So education, you want to study in a university, maybe they are going to ask you for an accreditation that you have a B2 level or a C2 level of one or other language. For Erasmus+, our flagship program in education in the EU, to do a mobility to Italy, you may need a B2-1 Italy certificate. Again, CEFR is there. For a lot of Erasmus projects, some of the aims may be linked to CEFR and language learning. And then for employment, of course, this is a huge one, for skills recognition. At the moment in the EU, we are very concerned about skills and the union of skills, so recognizability of skills and portability of skills. And then you probably know Europass. Europass is the CV that we are trying to promote as a way to apply for jobs in a way that is known to everybody. And there you are going to write your language skills according to the CEFR, and everybody is going to know what you mean and what they will be expecting. You can also use it for certification. There are digital certificates, Europass digital credentials. So if you have actually passed a test and the one giving the test has entered into this digital system, it will be visible that this is true, that you really got the certificate, and that there is a digital environment that ensures that you will not be able to tamper with that. So it's again another way to show.
Thank you, Anna.
Sorry, that was a bit long.
No,
it's very good.
That's okay. we were on the high
CEFR.
level in terms of political impact and value. Before I move to the more human level, I just want to say that we will have some time for questions, so get ready for some. Use the opportunity. That's the unique opportunity to have such a set in front of you. So get ready for some questions. Now, I would like to go a bit to the level of the user. And the question is pretty simple, and I would invite you to try to be as simple as in your answers. If I'm not mistaken, this policy document, as I sometimes provocatively say, this innocent policy document belongs to the most quoted, most frequently referred to publications of the Council of Europe. I have a feeling that that's the case. Then the question is, what made it so popular and so successful, you think, in the first instance. Now, anyone interested in reacting?
Well, I think that our colleague from the European Union made the point that it combines simplicity and complexity. Another way of putting that is that there was a person called, Michael Byram and Lynn Parmenter did a book called something like The Globalization of Language Policy, I think that was the title, in 2012, interviewing people about the CFR and the way it was used. And somebody from Argentina, Porto, I can't remember her Christian name, said, and this was echoed by other people, that the reason it was so popular with ministries was because it combines what they need. On the one hand, it has an instrumental aspect, which allows for the definition of objectives and also the certification of their achievement on the one hand, which is what their bosses expect them to provide. And on the other hand, it has a deep educational philosophy, the soft side, with plurilingualism, interculturality, mediation, etc. All of these aspects. And although it tends to be used outside Europe predominantly for English, it is potentially usable for all languages right across the board. And that, I think, was probably the main reason.
Okay,
and
thank you. Nick?
Well, of course, you've seen the blue book. There was also a red book. So it came out in 2001 in French and English. Since then, I believe it's been adapted into something like 40, perhaps you know now, Sarah, more than 40 languages, right? So I think one of the important things is it's been studied from different perspectives to do what it's supposed to do, which is support multilingualism and plurilingual education. And it was allowed to do that because although it's a publication of the Council of Europe, it's owned by the users, I think. This is how you might put it. You can take this book, and if it's useful to you, you can take bits of it, all of it, in ways which are going to help you and adapt it or to implement it for your purposes. And the purposes are quite often very similar, which is to organize language education, to have a network of stakeholders who have to align and bring together, who have to understand what the goals are and what the outcome success criteria are. And I think that made it immediately appealing and also usable. But I would say that the book itself, if you read it, is not that easy to understand. And the first time I read it, I thought this is not going to work necessarily without quite a lot of exegesis, some shedding light on what this means. And in fact, right from the beginning, and that's 1996, it was intended to have a range of what we call tools or additional documentation to help users with different needs to take it, use it, adapt it for their own purposes. So we produced, ALTE produced guidelines for item writers, for people interested in producing materials for tests. That was in 1997, the first one. There was also guidance for teaching. I forget, there was a whole array. Brian will probably array. And then we developed the bit which was missing, which is what does that actually mean for a specific language, right? So the framework is neutral. It's about learning any language. And so the Goethe was the first to say, well, for German, we need to be able to understand what it is we have to teach and what people have to learn at the different stages of learning aligned to the framework. So you had the Profile Deutsch, which came out, was that 1999? It was quite early. No, it was after. So it was in the early 2000s. And some of us here in there, led a program called the English Profile Program, which were reference level descriptions for English. So ALTE members, we have Italians here from Perugia, we have Goethe people here, we have Cambridge people. We all help to try and explain what the framework meant for learning different languages, because in the end you have to learn the words, the grammar, the discourse. You can't just do things. I can do in English, I can do in German. You need different words, right? So what are they and how do they compare? So I think these tools which were emerging also help to make it usable.
Okay, but isn't it a bit contradictory? I mean, on the one hand, we have a very successful publication. However, it requires a whole bunch of additional material in order to be used, in fact, which some people, as you already indicated, may complain that it's difficult to read, it's challenging to use, and yet it's so popular and successful. What remains the main challenge in using the framework and the companion volume then, you think?
Many things.
Many things. Huh.
Yeah. But
then,
we are working on
3.
those many things as we go along. I mean, Brian has a relatively new association which is addressing some of the things which are perhaps you feel have been delivered. Am I speaking for you?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, you. I mean,
okay.
That's an invitation.
Well,
I mean,
the challenges in relation to the framework, the biggest challenge is the misunderstandings and misrepresentations which started very quickly and which are all very much there. The prime one being that for some really strange reason, there is an assumption that the framework takes the native speaker as a point of comparison or as the ultimate goal of language learning, whereas that's never been the case ever. I mean, and it's even stated very clearly in Chapter 3 of the framework that this is not the case right at the very beginning. The aim is the plurilingual and intercultural, or plurilingual and pluricultural speaker who's comfortable and can behave appropriately in different cultures, in different languages, with the idea that all knowledge you have of any other languages is something to be valued. I think that's the main challenge there, and the other is that to do with teacher education, that as part of the process of producing the companion volume, or rather in the consultation phase at the end of sort of just finalizing it, I did a survey of member states, and it only got replies from 26 or 27 of the 46. But what came out was that the CFR was only used in half of those states in pre-service teacher education. So that means that half of the people who bothered to reply didn't use it in their pre-service education. And that, plus the fact that everywhere there seems to be a severe cutting back on in-service teacher education in all countries. That's the biggest challenge, that teachers are not being introduced, and nowadays you could say that I know that in Switzerland the CFR in pre-service education has been completely forgotten. So the challenges really are that it's not being put over in teacher education and in pre-service education, and if it is, then it's being done with too much of an emphasis on the levels and not on the educational philosophy.
Thank you.
So the companion volume is an attempt to turn that around and put the emphasis on the education and not the assessment.
Speaking of which, companion volume was elaborated in response to lots of feedback collected following the publication in 2001. At this conference, we keep discussing and raising this need for constant updating of our practices because of the technological development, for example. So the question is, would you see a need for any further development of this framework from your perspective? I would like to start with Anna. What would you wish for?
For us, at the EU, what is very important is consistency in the application. So, of course, because it's complex, everybody can interpret it a little bit different. And comparability, no? For instance, now, before I'm going to say something, we've been working a lot with the Council of Europe on this, on training countries and then teachers in countries and evaluators through the RELANG project, which you know very well because you are having
Quite well.
which means relating language assessment, examination.
To the framework.
To the framework, exactly. It's a very long thing, so I don't say it exactly right. But this is key, of course, to continue training, because even if we are celebrating the 25th and arguably maybe even older birthday, there is still an issue about consistency, no, in the quality of the implementation, no. And then member state comparability is also something that is very important for us, for the Union, because we want to learn from the best practices in member states, you know, and to be able to spread them and so on. And so, for instance, now there is a PISA test that took place in 2025, specifically a language assessment test that we are doing with OECD. We've been developing it also with help of Cambridge for many years. And this is going to give us also this opportunity to see where the best practices are, what are the contextual factors that have led to these practices, and all this is, of course, linked to the CEFR. So the tests have been developed always with the CEFR in mind.
Thank you. Then let's move over to Sarah to connect, because there were so many projects related to the framework already conducted at the center. What would you see as a need to develop it further? In what respect, if at all?
I think probably it is an instrument that's meant to be dynamic. So future developments will happen inevitably because society changes, new needs arise. What I would say, though, is since the publication of the companion volume, I think we need time to let that settle and really give people time to work with the companion volume. I think rushing to do further developments on the framework itself right now would not necessarily be the best thing to do. But I wanted to pick up on something Brian said about teacher education, and that's where both what we're doing in language policy and what we're doing at the ECML comes into play. Anna mentioned the RELANG initiative, which we run jointly with the European Union, and that's where we go into countries and work with experts on the ground. But there's a social justice aspect to the RELANG initiative, because we're looking at state examinations. We're looking at your baccalaureate, your matura exam, etc. And we're asking the question, why can't these exams, if they are valid and reliable, give access to university, give access to work? Why is an additional certification needed? And what can we do to increase the value of examinations that all young people have access to? And just on RELANG, we've run now 109 workshops in 33 countries. That's a lot of countries. Doesn't mean there isn't still work to do. At the ECML, it's been about bridging policy and practice. And right since the publication of the CEFR, there have been projects to support its implementation. But if I think about more recent ones, which relate very much to the companion volume, there's been a project called the CEFR CV Implementation Toolbox, and that's about helping teacher educators to disseminate the key messages of the companion volume. There's been a project on mediation, specifically on cross-linguistic mediation, and these two have come together and we offer them as further in-country training through our training and consultancy program. But we've also looked at the CEFR, for example, in relation to assessing home languages. And that's, you know, when I was talking yesterday about valuing all languages and valuing the learner's linguistic repertoire, how do we assess home languages when schools are so multilingual now? We can't expect teachers to know and understand all of the home languages their learners bring with them, but this is about valuing their prior learning. This is about recognizing that they can already do many things in their home language. So we have resources now under a project that was called Ricolang to help schools assess home languages. And then there's all the work we've done in relation to sign languages. Again, that's about inclusion, that's about social justice. And we, you know, the work that was done under the ProSign projects through the ECML contributed to the sign language descriptors that are now in the CEFR companion volume. And, you know, I can go right back to the beginning. There's an entire thematic area on curricula and evaluation that shows the number of projects there have been. But the key thing is we can keep producing more and more resources and more documents, but we need to mediate them. We need to work with people on the ground. And that's why the capacity building aspect of our work is so important. And what we're doing in language policy with this new reflection and planning tool, it's based on the recommendation, and the 2022 recommendation has 9 measures directed at teacher education. So there are policy and practice measures, there are also teacher education measures. And in this reflection and planning tool, we are asking people to come together, ministries, teacher educators, inspectors, pedagogical advisors, and really look at what they're doing both in pre and in-service teacher education. And if you think about the recommendation and you look at it closely and at the tool attached to it, the CEFR is the backbone of these key instruments. So we're really doing what we can to mediate and make sure that at the level of teacher education, we are promoting the CEFR and its companion volume.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have negotiated some extra minutes for Q&A. So I would love to hear questions from the audience now, so that we can have, we can let you use this opportunity to
just make
with
one
the panel.
comment.
Short one?
Very short, and is that the CFR now has global reach. And looking around this room, I see Gerarda from Asia, I see Walter from Latin America, I see a colleague from Azerbaijan, I see people from the USA, I see Hanan, who's dealing in the Arabic-speaking world. So there's plenty still to do with what we've got, I would say.
Exactly.
Okay.
What do other people think?
Thank you. Any questions you would like to pose? Any questions you always wanted to ask, but never had the opportunity to? Darren has a question?
I know.
How unusual.
You don't have the answers yet?
Not quite, no. But Sarah, it's a question for you. You talked about maturita, baccalaureate exams, and obviously it would be very nice if they all standardized and they all came together and they were all aligned to the CFR. Why doesn't the European Union, the Council of Europe, bring this together, be the central power for this, to kind of manage this, to make sure that all of these exams are standardized, have the Q mark, for example, or have some kind of mark of quality, which then you can or have power to go to the universities to say, please accept and please recognize this exam, please trust this.
Thank you. Anyone ready to answer?
Well, there are a number of issues around that, and the first one I would say is subsidiarity. Each country is responsible for its own education system, and many countries, in fact, it's at regional level. And the CFR was never really meant to be a standard setting. It was meant to be a reference document, right? And when you look at it carefully, there's a lot of elements in it that talk about the importance of contextualization. Contexts are different. across Europe, even within one country in Europe. But what the Relang project is doing is to try, and it's about autonomy as well, it's actually about giving the responsibility to the country, but supporting them in the process, making sure that they know what it means to develop a valid and reliable test. But ultimately, that responsibility is then handed over to the country. It's not the Council of Europe's role to tell countries what to do. That's not how we operate. It's very much a bottom-up process. But I can give you a concrete example. For example, after a number of seminars with the Relang experts in Slovenia, they now have the CEFR levels on their Matura certificate. And in universities in Slovenia, this is now accepted. So it's a small example, but it shows you that if you can upskill people and support them in understanding and using the framework, you can actually bring about change. But it's not our job to dictate to people how they organise their education systems. We're there to support.
Not part of the treaty.
No, definitely not.
Pretty clear.
Yeah. Maybe very, very quick, just to add that at the European Union, we also don't have these competences in education. It's member states who do the curriculums, the exams, so we can only facilitate. But of course, we are creating an atmosphere, or if you want, where this kind of certification is useful and it's used in a similar way. So we are getting there, but it's really a bottom-up.
Thank you. Brian?
I find this question rather confusing because I understood, as far as I understand, in most European countries, if you have a baccalaureate or a matura, you have a right to go to university. Certainly like that in France or... Right, so we're talking here about mobility. We're talking here about when teenagers find that their parents change country and whether Germany is going to accept a French baccalaureate or whether they will insist that this child takes a test to see if their German is good enough for them to be able to survive in school. So to clarify, anybody who is in a school system in a country, whether they're an immigrant or whether they were born there, provided they have a school leaving examination, they have a right to go to university. The exceptions are, well, in the UK you have A-levels, so it's just a different system, it's not an exception. I think the only exception is Sweden, but I'm not quite sure.
No, but it's also for someone within their own country applying to do a languages degree. Sometimes an additional certification is required.
For a language degree.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
So in order to study a language as opposed to medicine or whatever, you might need to take an examination.
Thank you.
Let's say you're in Bulgaria, you study French and you get French qualification in your own national qualification, maturita, and then you want to go and study in France. But the French universities don't recognize the maturita qualification, the language part of it.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
That's probably in their powers. Okay, further questions? Use the opportunity. Vincent, our trustee.
Thank you. I want to speak about the tools that people are developing with the CFR. What is happening now is that people are developing corpus. We have a working group in ALTE starting with this idea of a corpus. For French exams, we published a corpus for writing performances last year. I received more than 80 demands of universities all around the world. One association, we've developed an application for migrants, for refugees in camps with this corpus because we calibrated 6,000 performances for French. My question is very simple. Many people are developing this corpus. The NLP field has a strong need of this corpus. AI field, they have a very strong need of this corpus. you're speaking about open source tools. What is the strategy of the Council of Europe with this corpus? Do you have an official policy or strategy?
Not that I'm aware of, Vincent, no. I think it's something you and I should probably sit down and discuss in more detail, but I'm not aware of any particular policy or approach. Sometimes it's and this is the benefit of these kind of conferences, it's really hard to keep a tab on all the developments that are going on. I mean, it's simply impossible. So it's really great to hear about these things that are happening. And what we need to do is talk together and see whose role, you know, what is our role, what is your role? That's also one of the reasons for this round table on the CEFR. So yes, of course, it's about misuses and misunderstandings, but perhaps we could also, Brian, consider it as a way to, you know, get a handle on the big developments that are out there, because it's simply impossible for us to keep tabs on everything. But it sounds like really interesting work that you're doing, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about it.
Thank you. Please, go ahead. Don't hesitate. Don't be shy or too shy. Yes.
Computer online.
First and then down here. One over there first, isn't it? Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. Talking about the misinterpretations of the CFR, I would like to ask, it was mentioned that CFR cannot be used to talk about the language proficiency level of native speakers. Then my question is, in the context where a native language can also be your native language, but at the same time not language of instruction at school, then which framework would you suggest using to describe the language proficiency level of those learners?
Anyone ready to interact? That was a tough
one. I think there's a little misunderstanding there. What we said, or what I said, was that that in talking about somebody's second language or additional language proficiency, which is what the CFR is mainly about, the issue of whether the issue of native speakerism is a red herring. It's irrelevant. Now, when you're talking about somebody's, you're talking there about home languages, right? The assessment of home languages, it relates to what Sarah was talking about. And there is a kind of there is less enthusiasm about the idea of having a European-wide framework for home languages, because that's kind of regarded as more of a national sort of affair, organizing the language of schooling, the language of schooling. And so there isn't a framework of this type for the language of schooling. There are some places where the CFR is used in relation to the language of schooling, but there have been some ECML projects related to producing descriptors for different disciplinary areas in relation to the language of schooling. But as regards home languages, apart from the fact that with the European language portfolio, which was of course linked to the CFR, there was an encouragement to have everybody fill in their home languages as well as the language of schooling and the foreign languages which they were learning. But there isn't I mean, the idea of inventing another framework for people to rate their home languages strikes me as a bit rather a lot of work for little reward. I mean, the CFR is there, so you could use that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you pass over here?
Thank you. So you talked about sign languages, and a major effort has been done with the ProSign project, and then the implementation of tailored descriptors in the companion volume. And I was wondering, what are the next steps, and if you have any feedback on teacher training with the CFR and sign languages, and the implementation of high stakes or tests based on the CFR.
We have someone in the room who could answer this question, I think. Tobias?
Tobias. Join the panel, looks like.
Join us on the panel, Tobias.
Hello, my name is Tobias Haug from Zurich. I have been part of the ProSense project, actually. As far as I know, there are different approaches in different countries that the CFR should become part of sign language teacher training. I think to which extent it's very diverse. That's at least what I can say. We in Zurich at my university, we are currently, for example, implementing sign language curricula in the light of the CFR, trying to develop CFR-aligned assessment and so on. But that's a very long, ongoing process, as you can imagine. So until we really could say CFR is part of, for example, the professional DNA or identity of sign language teachers, I think there's still a long way to go. So this is more a Swiss perspective and my networks in other European countries. And then I think you have an ongoing project you might want to mention.
Yes, thank you, Tobias. Yes, we also have a current project at the ECML under development, and that's actually looking at sign languages, but particularly for migrants and refugees who use sign language or who are hard of hearing, because in a sense it's doubly difficult for them. So we're looking at how can we support them and encourage schools to think about what they can do to support such learners who are hard of hearing or who sign. And I also, we were recently involved in a webinar. There's a lot of work going on to promote the use of the descriptors in the companion volume. But as Tobias said, before it actually impacts on reality on the ground, it's going to take some time. But I think it's a major milestone that they're in there. And certainly for the Council of Europe, sign languages are part of Europe's linguistic diversity and therefore should be respected and valued in the same way as spoken languages.
Thank you very much. I think we need to stop, right?
We can do one more question.
One more question? Okay, one more question.
Just because he's on the side, he doesn't get seen, you see.
Thank you.
We're not being equitable.
As Dr. Saville said, the CFR has been used globally, right, today. Is there any effort or is there an initiative to transition from the common European framework to the global framework?
In terms of the global framework, my goodness. Brian, another project for you.
When there was a little lull in activity on the CFR around about 2012, there was some discussion as to whether we might even, involve UNESCO. And John Trim was quite keen on the idea of renaming it as a common world framework. I was always against the idea because the word European in the CFR is a statement of the limitations of validity, which you can interpret in two different ways. You can interpret it as a statement in relation to geography, or you can interpret it as a statement in relation to linguistics, because there are languages for which the CFR is obviously not so ideal, like, Japanese or Chinese. They do use it. I mean, Osaka University, as early as 2003, was demonstrating how they used the CFR in relation to 23 foreign languages by adapting it. Because the problem is with the reading and writing, it just doesn't work, right? So it would be hubris to claim that it is a world language. I mean, it is something which, a world framework. It comes from a European context. And as with all things, as with all of the work of the Council of Europe, that someone actually wrote a book about this, a little slim volume published by the British Council in about 1990. That this is placed there for people to use it if they want to, and if they feel and also can show for themselves that it is valid in that it can be adapted to their context. But if we were to call it a world framework, we would be claiming that it was possible to have something that was valid in all contexts. And
which we don't want to do.
Exactly, that's the difference.
But we could, and I do, call it the CFR. So the E is sort of elided. So it's a common framework of reference that originated in Europe, right? And that's what you must recognize because that's its heritage. But we have many projects, very good projects, where it's been looked at, tested out, and been changed to a certain extent to be relevant as a framework of reference in a particular educational and cultural context. So the Vietnamese project that did it is a very good example of this. What they call the CEFR J, or the CFR from Japan, is also another very good example of how meticulously the Japanese looked at it, decided that it was going to be useful to them, and then adapted it so that you now find it in the Japanese school curriculum referenced with a lot of the characteristics of the CEFR in its origin, but also adapted to the local.
Thank you very much. Final sentences, final word.
Just to say that the CFR is used in the state school systems of over 50 countries, and a lot of those are outside Europe.
Thank you. Sarah?
And possibly just to say it is a Council of Europe instrument, and I don't think the Council would be particularly happy if the word European were to disappear.
We need to set up a Council of the World before we do that. Anna, your final statement, if you have any.
Congratulations to the anniversary.
Yeah, okay. Congratulations to the anniversary. It's either 25, 35, or even 55 if you want. Thank you very much, panelists. That was great. Great panel. Thank you. Thank you, audience. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Pepper up your noses and get ready for some fun.